Hello, everybody.
Hello, everyone.
How are you, man? You good?
Me?
Yes.
Yes, I'm very well, Christopher. How are you?
Good. We've had our first shop clinic,
First shop clinic, yeah.
and it went really well. I hope
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
it did.
A few teething problems here and there, but it was a good one.
And we had a good podcast with those guys, so I hope you all enjoyed it.
I had a good half of a podcast with
Yeah,
one
you
of those
did.
guys.
You had busier other things to do.
I had to save Dave because it was a bit like a zombie apocalypse downstairs.
Okay.
With people coming in the door, and Dave only had a rake to fight them off with.
Right,
so
okay. So you had a stack of vinyl.
Naturally, I had a Kalashnikov in my back pocket to come and save the day.
Casually. So that was the last episode. This episode is going to be something different for you all. Something different for us.
It's an exciting episode,
it
man.
really
I'm
is.
so buzzing.
Yeah. We are joined by the wonderful Dr. Matt Brennan. Hello, Matt.
Hey, how's it going?
Very well, and you?
I'm doing fine.
Yeah.
First doctor in the house.
It is our first doctor.
Yeah.
So you are an academic.
I am an academic, not a medical doctor. So, yeah, can't help anyone who's got a heart attack or any other medical emergency.
coronavirus.
Exactly, indeed. Yeah.
Can you-
Not the kind of doctor you need.
In an emergency, is there a doctor in the room? Can you let everybody know what's up, what you do?
For
and-
those who maybe don't know who you
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, sure thing. So my name is Matt, and I am a music academic working at the University of Glasgow, although I am originally, you may be surprised to learn, not from Scotland. I am born in Nova Scotia in Canada.
Cool. New
and-
Scotland.
Indeed. And raised in New Brunswick, about an hour and a half away from the Sabian factory, in fact.
Wow, cool.
So, yes, the drum history kind of goes down through the river from the Sabian factory to Fredericton, where I was raised. But I moved over to Scotland a long time ago now, back in 2002, to do a master's degree.
Right. And
then loved it so much that I just stuck around, got involved in playing in bands, and from a master's to a PhD, and now I'm teaching popular music and music industries, music and society, up in the music department at Glasgow Uni.
Great. And you just dropped a new book.
That's right.
I believe it's called Kick It, The Social History of the Drum Kit.
That's right.
Cool. So we're excited to talk about this because this is something that we don't get to talk about every day. And I think I'm a really big fan of it. I did a jazz degree. That's going to be a joke.
Yeah.
At some point. And I loved the history element that we got taught. So it's good to see someone acknowledging that the drum kit is perhaps the most socially significant instrument.
Yeah, I like to think so.
Yeah.
And I've tried to collect as much evidence to prove that's the case. Yeah.
I was saying to Matt on the drive up here, it's like, do you know, like, this is probably the episode that makes the most sense in a drummer's podcast to, like, find the foundations of, like, why we're all here, why we play the drums.
Yeah, totally. So can you give people a sort of broad overview of the book, and we'll try and not give away too much content while we talk about it so that when people read it...
Yeah, 100%. So, I mean, the first thing that's probably important to say is that it's obviously not the first book on the drum kit or the history of the instrument even. Mm-hmm. So there's been a lot of amazing literature that's come before, great histories of, say, individual drum companies, or of the kind of nuts and bolts elements of the construction of drum kits. There's also a lot of great material on, say, the evolution of different drumming styles over history, or biographies of kind of canonical, really famous drummers who shaped the instrument. So knowing that all those types of books were already out in the world, and knowing that I'm as a drummer myself, I mean, I introduced myself as on the kind of academic side of things, but I've also been playing the drum kit, since I was 12 years old.
Okay,
and so it's it's been a long time obsession of mine, I guess. But when it came to writing a book about the kit, my training is more sort of in sociology and social history of popular music. And so I really wanted to know, how the drum kit shaped the development of music history, but also like how the status of drummers as musicians, as artists, as types of workers, how that's evolved over time. And I also wanted to draw connections between the kit and different genre formations, I guess, in the history of popular music in particular, because in a lot of existing literature, you'll maybe get like you were talking about how you studied jazz. So, there are books out there on jazz drumming in particular, and books out on, funk, for instance. But there aren't many books that sort of present a real overview of how the drum kit was quite pivotal in the formation of all of these new genres. And when you kind of put that together and realize that actually, the drum kit was right there at, the dawn of the 20th century, there for the birth of jazz, but also central to like all these subdevelopments in jazz. Without the drum kit, no bebop. It was really the first thing to change in the evolution of so many jazz styles, but then also crucial to the birth of rhythm and blues, rock and roll. Back in the days of the 1950s, some people called it rock and roll, other people called it beat music. That's not so commonplace now that we tend to think of that, but it's absolutely true. So it's pivotal there. Birth of funk, birth of hip hop, disco, electronic dance music. You can't say that actually for any other instrument. Wow. Right? You think about maybe other contenders for the most pivotal musical instrument of the last 200 years. The electric guitar, maybe, the synthesizer. They're obviously very important instruments, but they don't have that longevity. And they also, they come in at particular moments in history. But if we're thinking about, like, in a way, how modernity itself develops, right? The drum kit is a really interesting lens to look at the last 200 years of human history, essentially, and cultural history. So the book is, that makes it sound a little super grand and ambitious, but really it's just trying to think about, in a nutshell, how the drum kit as an instrument, drummers as musicians, and drumming as a practice have changed and been shaped by world events, and also gone on to shape cultural history over the past century and a half or so.
Man.
Not a light topic, is it?
So we're not going to get through it all in one podcast.
No, of course not. It becomes a David Lean film.
That's right.
So I guess, man, like if looking at the sort of contents of the book and things, it kind of starts with slaves.
With the transatlantic slave trade. Yeah, in a way, it doesn't have a single starting point.
Right.
But certainly you could make the argument that the drum kit coalesced on American soil, and that although the combination of, say, if we think of a drum kit as its most essential, as someone making the decision to take that bass drum that was maybe strapped to their chest in a marching band and say, actually, I'm going to put this on the floor. That sounds easier. And then, after a period of time thinking, actually, I'm going to maybe fashion some sort of device that will allow me to play this drum with my foot. And then thinking about, once that's occurred, the bass drum, the snare drum, and some array of a pair of cymbals or even a single cymbal being the kind of very core of that instrument. That the bass drum, snare drum, and cymbals existed in different musical cultures in Europe, for instance.
Yeah, for a long time, right?
But it took a certain type of music to kind of bring that instrument to life, and that music was the music of the African American diaspora from the slave trade, sort of mixing and intermingling with all these different styles in the United States, and then kind of illuminating the potential of the combination of those three percussion instruments. So that's why the book starts with the transatlantic slave trade, is that you could say, actually, the kick drum, snare drum, and cymbals come together in Europe, but they don't really have the impact that they're going to have, and that potential of that as a revolutionary instrument is not fully demonstrated until that mixes with the particular blend of musical cultures that were happening in the United States as a result of the slave trade and these diasporic musical traditions.
Do you think it was because it was regular people playing it?
Absolutely. Regular people playing it and regular people inventing it.
Yeah.
This is actually really important. You know, when we think about other instruments, say the history of the trumpet, you know, trumpet players aren't going around in the 19th century thinking, I've got this brilliant instrument, but if only I could make it more compact and portable, you know? Or if only, right? Like, that doesn't happen in the history of lots of other instruments. And, you know, they tend to change much more slowly. They tend to come from, you know, centers of musical instrument making that are already at quite a far remove from practitioners. But the drum kit has this history where it's really, you know, shaped by, in its early days, practicing drummers who were looking for solutions to problems in their working lives.
Right.
You know, like, it's a problem if I've got an orchestra director in the 19th century saying to the symphony, listen, we need to recreate a military battle scene here, but we're in a really cramped orchestra pit, and we've only got one percussionist, right? When the sound that you're trying to recreate is that of 10 percussionists on the field, you know, playing. Well, I mean, we can think about the pipe and drum bands of Scotland as being one of those instruments, one of those influences, but lots of different military influences as well, right? In different nations and traditions. When it comes to trying to like reproduce that sound in musical theater in the 19th century in operettas, you know, suddenly drummers are having to get kind of crafty, and they're having to like solve problems of labor. How do I, as one person, play what ordinarily 3 different people would be playing? And then B, problems of space. How do I do what was meant to be played out on like an open field, launching people into battle? How do I do that in like 4 square feet of space, you know, in a Manhattan theater that's a fire hazard, right? Like, that is the crucible in which the drum kit starts to take shape.
Don't think much has changed there.
That's right.
So then, how does it become a timekeeping instrument?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question.
From like, because if you're talking about it used as a war instrument, like, from my understanding is, you might prove me wrong, but rudiments were field calls, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So they would have been played in time.
Yeah,
but then the whole kit the whole drum kit as we know it.
Yeah.
How does it go from that, when it's signaling something, to being a timekeeping instrument?
So definitely drums in a military context, they had several functions. One is exactly as you're pointing out, like different rudiments or calls would signal different actions. Yeah. So, you know, they have drum signals like the reveille, which is the wake-up call, essentially, right, of the 19th century, before you could phone it into the reception downstairs. There was also a timekeeping function in a military context, obviously, for regimenting soldiers and getting them to march in order in an imposing way. That's something that really comes from the Ottoman Empire and Turkish Janissaries in particular. They were the first military bands, and this is going back all the way to the 14th century. They were the first military music to really bring something that had some, it wasn't exactly a bass drum, but it had a relationship to it. It was, you know, a double-headed, you know, large drum, and it was played in combination with cymbals. And this music was really, really different from what was going on the European continent, where you had Swiss fife and drum players, you know, sort of playing a predecessor to the snare drum, the side drum, very similar actually to what you would find in a Scottish pipe snare drum, you know, nowadays. But the kick drum, the cymbals in these janissaries, they would come together and, oh geez, I'm losing my train of thought here. What was your original question?
So how did it go from being...
to a timekeeping device. Yeah. I was like, Matt, you're all off in the 14th century now. This is the problem when you ask an historian a question, is that like we get lost and forget what century we're in. To becoming a timekeeping device. So, you know, those different influences over the centuries start to create a timekeeping function as well as a kind of communication function in a military context. And what's interesting, I guess, is that those influences start to manifest themselves in concert music, by which I mean like people seated in an auditorium.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll find in classical music, by the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, for any drummers who are maybe studying in a kind of percussion degree or a classical music degree, you might see occasionally a wee description on a score that says alla turca. And that means like the Turkish Janissaries, essentially. Right. It means hit bass drums and cymbals and make it sound like a march. So already by the beginning of the 19th century, you have bass drum and cymbals and sometimes snare drum performing a sort of underlying timekeeping function and adding a sense of excitement to music. But by the time you reach the turn of the 20th century and say ragtime music, where suddenly those African-American polyrhythms are coming in, that syncopation is coming in, that sense of improvisation is coming in, that's when the drum kit or bass drum, snare drum, and cymbals provide a timekeeping function, which is also providing something additional, something that we might call groove or pulse, which is actually like so penetrating that it begins to take the spotlight away from the harmony and melody that's happening, and what people actually start desiring is that beat, right? This becomes really apparent in dance music. So another way of answering your question is that in 1800, if I wanted to throw a party and I wanted it to be a dance party, it would look pretty different in a lot of ways. But one key element is that if I hired a band, or a group of musicians to play that music for dancing, it wouldn't necessarily include percussion or drums. In fact, often it would not.
Okay.
By 1900, that situation has changed, and you're starting to see this really early precursor to the drum kit, which was known then as the trap drummer's outfit, being maybe the second thing they would look for after a piano.
Right.
This combination of piano and drums seemed to be like the core two things that you would have, whether or not that was for scoring a silent film or whether it was for providing some background dance music for dancers. And then by 1920, you can't have dance music without the drum kit.
Right.
It's actually become essential. And the very notion of a rhythm section, that's a concept that has a history as well. 1800, people didn't really talk of the rhythm section, right? By 1920, this notion of the rhythm section being the drummer and then some sort of bass instrument. It could be an upright bass, or it could be like a tuba or a sousaphone at that time. But some sort of notion where you've got both that percussive rhythmic timekeeping element and then that pitched bass instrument letting you know where those chords are going. But those are providing the foundation of the music. And that's super important for dancing. And then people decide, actually, we also really rather just like sitting down and listening to this stuff as well.
Yeah. Because it would have still been providing color as well, right? Because things like you talk about like bones and that kind of thing, that the cowbells and
that was super prevalent in the early 20th century.
So it's like it's still got this orchestral element where these instruments were used to provide texture and color within an orchestra, but also this rhythmic element now to get people moving.
100%. Yeah. No, in the early 20th century, just as nowadays, you've kind of got your core sense of, you got a kick drum, you got your rack tom, floor tom, snare drum, pair of hi-hats, ride cymbal, crash cymbal. That's maybe what we would call a sort of basic drum kit in the 21st century. And that's really something that kind of takes shape from the mid-1930s, really from Gene Krupa onward and his influence on the kit. But prior to that, you still had these things called trap drummers' outfits, what we would call early drum kits. But a key difference was that they had all these bonkers accessories, right? So cowbells, but also temple blocks. Chinese temple blocks were considered like super essential in the 1920s, very common. In the jazz age, like say from the end of World War I up to the end of the 1920s, It would also not be uncommon to have things like car motor horns attached. So like klaxons, motor horns,
ratchets and all that.
Ratchets, exactly. All that stuff would be attached to the rim of the bass drum, or sometimes there would be a little table, like almost like a music stand, affixed to the top of that bass drum called the trap table. And that's where they would put all these additional effects. But that was seen as being like very much a core element of what a drummer was supposed to do. And part of that is coming from basically just injecting a sense of subversion into music, that, we're going to play these things that people would ordinarily classify as just noisemakers, but we're going to make music with them. And that was, part of the great appeal of jazz. That was the same way in which a trombone player might say, I'm going to make this trombone through sliding it in an unconventional way, something that the designer of a trombone had never intended and would have cringed at probably. I'm going to make it sound like an animal, brawling or something like that. So too with the drummer then say, oh yeah, well, I'm going to like make my drum kit sound like a factory or a car, but I'm going to throw down some rhythm that you can dance to with this as well. So drums were considered to be highly noisy devices, like, and then we can also talk about this tension between musical instruments or noisemakers. That's another thing that the drummer sort of starts to shape. And that happens in dance music, also happens in classical music. But yeah, these things were absolutely central to those early drum kits.
Yeah. And from my understanding of the history of the music, it's really when the ride cymbal came around that it really changed.
Yeah, that was certainly...
So that was like 40s?
Yeah, a huge shift. You will see by the end of the 20s and into the 1930s, people playing something that we might hear as a ride pattern for parts of a song. So they would have a suspended cymbal. Certainly there was no such thing called a ride.
No.
Let's get that straight. There were cymbals, and it was very common if you were going to have... this is also sort of predating the hi-hat, which really only comes into play at the end of the 1920s as well.
Yeah.
But if you had one cymbal, you would probably have a Turkish cymbal made by Zildjian or someone trying to imitate a Zildjian cymbal. And it would look, very much like a crash cymbal nowadays, probably smaller and thicker than the fashion is for cymbals nowadays. And it would also be very common to have a Chinese cymbal, actually. These were very popular cymbals on drum kits throughout the 1920s, but definitely nothing looking like a ride. Although you can listen to jazz recordings at the tail end of the 1920s, say Louis Armstrong with Zeddy Singleton or drummers like that, and they will play these little breaks, essentially, where there's a moment in the song where they'll do something like a dang, 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 cha, and then they'll choke that cymbal. You can almost hear it in your head. As it's become quite commonplace as a kind of signifier of a particular era of jazz. But that was more used in the way that we might play a drum fill now. Okay. To kind of punctuate at the end of 8 bars. All right, we're going into the bridge. So, and then you'd be back to playing those rolls on the snare drum and a pulse on the kick drum. But over the course of the 1930s, the first major thing to happen is that Avitas Zildjian moves to the United States and establishes an American Zildjian factory in Massachusetts. This is the first time that Zildjian cymbals were actually being made in the United States and close to the jazz world. So Zildjian, in order to figure out how to sell more cymbals, starts asking drummers, like, what do you need? And drummers like Gene Krupa and other prominent players in the 1930s say, we like your cymbals, but could you make them thinner? And could you make them larger? And over the course of the 1930s, that gradually evolves into a point where by the 1940s, you have something like a bounce cymbal or a ride cymbal. And the first drummer to really kind of use that to its full potential, by which I mean playing what we now think of as like the standard jazz ride cymbal pattern throughout an entire song, would be Kenny Clarke. right when World War II breaks out.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually very difficult to pinpoint it because very few recordings were being made at that time due to a shortage in shellac, actually. Because of the war, shellac was being rationed, and also there was a musicians' union strike where they banned recordings for a couple of years between 1942 and 1944. So, like, almost no recordings from that really key moment in drumming history exist. But most people say it's Kenny Clarke, playing in Upper Manhattan, who begins to make that transition, which is then consolidated by Max Roach in the 1940s. And once Max starts kicking that into gear with the ride cymbal, like, everyone's doing it.
Yeah, because the music was getting too fast, right? They couldn't play it any other way.
Well,
from what I remember.
It's a combination of various factors.
Right, okay.
You know, it's a matter of speed, complexity, but also it's a matter of basically it's an economic necessity at a certain stage. Once World War II hits, a lot of large dance bands either break up because of musicians being drafted into the war, or it becomes economically hard times, I guess. So, you know, this touring circuit that big bands once had, people start looking for different ways to make a living out of music. And one way is reducing the size of the band, right?
Okay,
down to smaller groups. And so bebop bands, you know, jazz trios and quartets enter a phase of popularity, partly just changing taste, but then also some of these societal factors that I've been describing are also at play there. And with that, that kind of frees up the drummer to start doing different things. And crucially, this music isn't necessarily always being something that folk are automatically going to dance to. This is a moment when jazz starts to move into small clubs, and people are mostly kind of sitting down to listen to this stuff and maybe have a drink while listening to it. But that 4-on-the-floor pulse no longer super required, so that timekeeping element starts to move over to the cymbal via drummers like Kenny Clarke and others. And that also frees them up to do slightly strange things at the time, you know, accenting and punctuating, and entering into a dialogue on the kick drum and snare drum with their fellow musicians in that small group. So that's a very, like, tiny condensed way of explaining some of the things that affect that transition over to keeping time on the ride cymbal. And you got to also remember Papa Joe Jones was keeping time on the hi-hat throughout the second half of the 1930s as well. Again, maybe not for entire songs, but in shorter bursts. So, you know, it's not like there's, you know, one moment where, you know,
totally,
there's a switch. There's an evolution. It's gradual. But certainly the 1930s, almost no one is playing time on a cymbal for the duration of a song. By the mid-1940s, loads of people are. It's the thing to do.
That's really fascinating. I had absolutely no idea, because I'm that naive that I did think it was like, oh, here's a ride cymbal now. You know, like, no, of course,
totally
it makes total sense.
I mean, hi-hats used to be played almost on the floor, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
They were called sock cymbals because...
Sock cymbals are low boys. Yep. And also snowshoe pedals. Based on the design of some of the way they looked, it almost looked a bit like a snowshoe. But yeah, clanging two cymbals together with your left foot, it took a little time before the notion of taking those from foot level and raising them up where you could also start doing stuff with your hands by means of this metal shaft, you know, towards something that we now call the hi-hat pedal. You know, that took some time. Interestingly, the term hi-hat, there is no solid evidence that we have as to, like, where that name comes from. But one thing I encountered, and this is sort of a pet theory of mine, you can just stop me talking if
no,
because I will go off on tangents.
This is great.
But what's interesting is that in the 1920s, in men's fashion, the kind of posh headwear of the day was the top hat, also known as the high hat, right?
Right.
And hi-hats, by which I mean, like, you know, the fancy hats of the kind like Abraham Lincoln had, if you need like a mental picture, you know, they'd moved on a bit. They weren't as tall. But the other key thing with these hi-hats in the 1920s, they were fashionable, and they collapsed.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So these hats you wear on your head squished down,
Magician's
so they were
hat.
more portable.
Yeah.
And you can think of the top bit of that high hat as being a bit smaller than the bottom rim. And early advertisements for the hi hat stand mirrors that exactly, in that it wasn't like you had a 14-inch bottom and a 14-inch top. You had the top, which was a bit smaller than the bottom. And I think, although, and I've looked for archival evidence to like trace exactly this origin, but I think one plausible explanation is that the hi-hat gets its name from the resemblance that it bore to a collapsible top hat or men's hat.
That's fascinating.
So,
like, what sparked this whole urge to write this book?
Yeah.
Like, what? I guess that's my follow-up question to all of this.
Sure.
Would be like,
well, I guess like Chris, when I left high school, this was in New Brunswick, Canada, some years ago now, I decided, okay, you know what I love to do is play the drums. So I'm going to go do a jazz drumming degree. And so I went to a jazz drumming degree in Montreal. And when I got there, the first thing I noticed was that although in my small town, I'd been, like, not top of the heap drummer necessarily, but like, a decent drummer. When I got to Montreal, I was just scraping by, Oh my goodness, the level of players there. I was like, I had to practice, 6-7 hours a day just to like stay afloat, And that was good, and I really enjoyed doing it, but it also made me realize, oh my God, being a pro, pro gig and jazz drummer, that is you have to be super, super talented and super, super disciplined to make a decent living out of being a jazz drummer. And so that made me sort of question like whether that was necessarily where my skill set laid, because the simultaneous realization that I had was that I loved books and that actually I liked writing. So I was asking all these questions that my fellow drummers didn't seem to care about, so like, what's the meaning of this?
Yeah.
Or, what's, how we take these, my elective course in sociology where they're talking about different social movements and like how they influenced cultural and political history. Like, how might we apply that to music? I was a nerd, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. I was really interested in these questions, and I also loved playing the kit. And by the end of my undergraduate degree, I had transferred out of a jazz drumming degree and into a degree in English and philosophy, through which I became interested in the study of popular culture on the one hand and musical aesthetics on the other. And the whole reason I moved to Scotland from Canada was that one day in my undergraduate days, I was reading this book called Performing Rights on the Value of Popular Music. And it was written by a guy named Simon Frith. And I'd never heard this guy's name before, but I loved this book. He was talking about, why we value music. And like, I was getting revved up by this. I was so excited by it. I Googled up his name, and it came up, professor at the University of Stirling. I was like, what is Stirling? I had no clue.
People still ask.
yeah.
I had a great time at Stirling, actually. But
so much history.
In any case, I gave this guy an email, and he was an eminent sociologist of music and sort of a pioneer of studying popular music in universities. Like, where I came from, you studied jazz or you studied classical music. Studying rock and roll in university, like, not yet a thing.
Oh, really?
Maybe outside of like Berkeley College in Boston, it was definitely like not on the table as an option at the university I went to study at. And, that maybe shows you how long ago this was happening. But it was a real eye-opener to me that you could actually like go and do serious research on this. And that was when I was 22 years old. And that's what made me move from Canada to the UK. And that's what got me interested in writing books, generally speaking. And so by the time I had kind of gotten into that world in my mid-20s, I thought, I really want to write a book on the drum kit. Mm-hmm. And I really want a book that asks the kind of questions that I don't think have been answered yet, that I'm really keen to investigate. And then I got a little bit distracted, started playing in bands. But essentially, I spent, I had this idea for doing this book 10 years ago, and I spent the last 10 years gradually in my spare time chipping away at this as a kind of like solo project. While doing lots of other things like getting qualifications and having a job and paying rent and also playing in bands and making records and this sort of thing. And then finally for it to come out just a couple weeks ago.
Amazing.
Yeah.
There you go.
Amazing.
So that's a very long answer to your question.
Oh no, it's great. So that's like 10 years worth of all this. It's kind of led you to this point. That's really cool.
That's right. Yeah.
Amazing. So with the music then, we've got to the point where we've kind of got a ride cymbal and all that. Now, how do you get to a backbeat?
Yeah.
Because it, if we're talking about how this instrument functions within popular music, there comes a point where jazz is not so popular now.
Yeah.
But all those, we've straightened it out and there's a backbeat and...
For sure. So the backbeat has a pretty long history as well. The super condensed version of it is the backbeat predates someone throwing down a 2 and 4 on the snare drum, right? When we think of the gospel tradition and that kind of, clapping on 2 and 4.
Oh, okay.
People are doing a backbeat, even though it's maybe not on the drums.
Right.
In American popular music for some time before people start playing it consistently on the snare on 2 and 4. And even in the 1930s, similar actually to the evolution of the ride cymbal, people are maybe trying out the backbeat or using it to at the end of a song to really give it emphasis. So you can listen, for instance, to Benny Goodman's famous live concert recording at Carnegie Hall in 1938 with Krupa on drums. And you'll hear him very distinctly, not for the whole duration of a song, but for sections, just thump out that backbeat, and the crowd goes crazy for it, right? But it's really to emphasize a certain section of a song rather than to kind of provide the underlying pulse for its duration. So when we talk about the backbeat moving over to snare drum and being played consistently throughout a song, we're really looking to the second half of the 1940s, so post-World War II, that starts to happen in what at the time were called race records. So, super controversial to even think that was an official nomenclature of a chart, of a record chart at the time. But what they're trying to describe is dance music intended for African American audiences. And on the Billboard charts, in the same way that you would have a pop and a country chart, you would have a race chart.
Whoa.
Yeah, throughout the
Seriously?
1940s.
Whoa.
And it was only until 1949 that a guy named Jerry Wexler said, actually, do you know what? I don't think it's appropriate to sort of segregate and ghettoize this particular kind of music in that way. And so Billboard asked this guy, Jerry Wexler, who went on to co-found Atlantic Records, well, what would you use instead? We need to designate this particular type of music because this is the way we think the market of popular music works. And he's like, well, how about we call it something like rhythm and blues? And overnight, the race records chart in 1949 became designated the rhythm and blues chart.
Wow.
Yeah.
Whoa.
True story.
True story, bro.
And while all that was happening in the second half of the 1940s, you have significantly in New Orleans, but also in Chicago, drummers starting to lay down a backbeat for either the majority or the full extent of a song. The track that most people cite as kind of being the origin of the backbeat is a Fats Domino recording, I think from 1948, called The Fatman, with Earl Palmer on the drums.
Okay, great.
Who went on to play with Little Richard and loads of amazing records. Earl Palmer also significantly the guy who's attributed with taking that swing pattern on the ride cymbal and straightening it out.
Right.
So moving from, dang, 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 dang to dang, 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 check, ding, 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 ding. And the reason why he started doing that in the mid-1950s, according to him, was purely to follow Little Richard's hand as he was pounding out the straight eighth notes on the piano. And he just naturally started moving over. But if you listen to like early Elvis Presley recordings from around the same time, it's really strange because it's got this mix of like straight feel and swing feel. And a lot of like 1950s rock and roll records are characterized by that. Sometimes there's like half the band is playing straight, or Chuck Berry's playing like a straight kind of guitar, but the drummer's swinging behind him. And so there's this really interesting transitional period. But that is all sort of wrapped up in this move to reliance on the backbeat. And between the period 1945 and 1955, suddenly by 1955, you have that being a really integral part of dance music of the day, which is why it was sometimes called rock and roll, but just as frequently called beat music. And you have these descriptions in American magazines of that time trying to define exactly what this music was and why it was, really successful with teenage audiences. And they say very distinctly, there's this strange beat on 2 and 4 that's like really insistent and happens all the way through a song. Like we don't know what's happening, but people really seem to like it. And so that wasn't to say that it started happening in 1955, but by that point, everyone was noticing that this was an increasingly popular element of hit records.
So, okay.
Mic drop.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like there's so many questions keep coming up. But then, so like 10 years later, say we're in the mid-50s, 10 years later, you have drummers as celebrities because you have guys like Ringo and all these people coming out that are making this music even more popular now. Because the Beatles, when they came around, like 63, is it 63? They were on. And so many people talk about that.
Ringo joined the band in 62, I believe.
Right.
And then by 63, there was Beatlemania in the UK. And in February 1964, that was the famous Ed Sullivan appearance in the United States.
But they're playing rock and roll.
Yeah, for sure.
Twist and Shout and all these things that were old rock and roll tunes.
All
right?
These Chuck Berry tunes, Fats Domino tunes, absolutely.
So how do you get drummer as a celebrity then from that? Because like guys like Gene Krupa were around, but they weren't.
You can't discount the celebrity status of Gene Krupa in the first half of the 20th century. He was as big as Hollywood actors.
Really?
Were. Absolutely.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, wow. He was a big star.
He was the guy.
Well, and this was what famously led to him leaving the Benny Goodman band, was that Benny Goodman couldn't stand the fact that his drummer was more popular than he was.
Oh, wow.
And that was true by all accounts. Krupa was probably the best known pop musician of the 1930s. I mean, maybe apart from singers, but maybe the best known instrumentalist, if that makes sense. He certainly was exceptionally popular and more popular than any drummer had been before in public consciousness. The first global drum superstar, I would say, as well, because jazz music was really the first American music to really make a global impact and travel all over the world. And he continued to be the most famous drumming star until Ringo in the early 1960s.
So in the 1930s, he was like the jazz 1930s Beyonce.
Exactly. He was jazz Beyonce.
He was jazz Beyonce.
That analogy breaks down at some point. But
yeah, sure. Yeah, a little
but
bit.
he was a big star. Yeah, for sure.
He was in film as well, wasn't he?
He was in film. He was all over the radio. He was on the covers of magazines. He was a good-looking guy as well. So he had a kind of movie star visual quality to him that, say, his band leader Benny Goodman did not have.
Right.
And also, it should be said, he was the first big celebrity musician who was taking this music, which had been innovated and developed by African Americans, and putting it over with a white face to a white audience in the same way that Elvis Presley would do with rhythm and blues, in the same way that, say, Eminem does with rap in the late 1990s. This is a story which happens over and over again in popular culture.
So, okay, every time you give me give us an answer, I want to, there's about 20 questions. So, we're talking now that genre is becoming a thing, right? Because we have jazz was the popular music, and I guess for a long time there would probably be jazz and classical, right? Maybe some others, but we're now getting into rock and roll, jazz. How does the role of the drums change with genre?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the key arguments that I try and make in the book is that although we tend to think about traditionally the formation or creation of new music genres being associated with a particular singer-songwriter or singer or band leader, when you actually look at the genesis of those genres, what is often driving that change is the drum kit. And that can be said from the very birth of jazz down onwards. So certainly when I was studying jazz history in university, when we were taught how that music developed, it, almost always taught by someone who played saxophone or trumpet themselves. They would say, well, there were these famous saxophone and trumpet players. Go figure. And they invented this music and everyone followed along, but it was these amazing soloists who were able to play improvised, innovative blues scales over particular changes in music. What's interesting is that when you actually go back to the news coverage and digital search is an amazing thing now, that you just couldn't do 20 years ago when I was being taught these courses, is I can actually go to check out, give me all of the hits where jazz is mentioned in the New York Times between 1916 and 1920 and see what they're actually talking about, or in the London Times for that matter. What's really interesting is that frequently they're not talking about the trumpet or the saxophone. They're talking about the drum kit. Because the drum kit is this brand new instrument. No one knows what the heck it is. It's there on stage with all these other instruments that they recognize. And they're like, is it an instrument? What is it? It's got, and remember, at the time, it's got car motor horns and cowbells and things that are not instruments for most people, right? And even today, still, you'd be wondering, what the heck is that doing up there? Are they making music or are they making noise with this thing? And so jazz was frequently described as an intensely noisy music, and the central driver of that noise, what was making this music different from music that had come before, was the drummer and the presence of the drum kit. And really interestingly, when you look outside of coverage in the United States, when jazz begins to move over to places like France and Germany and Australia, for those places, when they try to describe what this new American phenomenon known as jazz is, basically a lot of the critics at the time say what constitutes the jazz in the band is the drummer. If it has a drum kit, it's a jazz band. If it doesn't have a drum kit, it's not a jazz band, right? That is the defining feature of that music, at least for those people who are encountering it for the first time. Now, obviously, the development of that music is much more complex than that. But from a public perception perspective, what makes that such a sensational music, by which I mean grabs hold of the public imagination and becomes worth talking about and worth spreading around and popularizing, is the presence of this new instrument called the drum kit. The same thing could easily be said of the birth and rock and roll. People are very well used to the drum kit by that point, but it's this insistence, this new role that the drum kit is playing, functioning, hammering that 2 and 4 on the backbeat, that forces people to say, what are we talking about? Well, I guess we'll call it beat music. What are these groups that are forming in the UK in the early 1960s? They're not called rock groups in the NME and the Melody Maker, which were the two kind of key music papers of that time. They're called beat groups. There's a clue in the name of the Beatles, as to what they think the most important element of that music is, right? They were not called that by accident or because they couldn't think of anything else. It's because all that music was being referred to as the Mersey beat sound. These were beat groups that were playing. If you were, it made sense to call yourself the Beatles. That is what that name is signifying, right? Okay. Is that consistent beat element and the drummer hammering it super hard. So you could also say the same of the birth of hip hop, for instance. We think, actually, like, there's no like live drum kit unless we're talking about the Roots or some band like that. Really, when we think of the birth of hip hop, what we're talking about is 2 turntables and a microphone, or that's the sort of like in a nutshell legend that we get when we think about the origins. But let's like actually examine that. In 1973, there was a DJ named Kool Herc who was throwing dance parties in the Bronx in New York City, and he has this innovative idea to take 2 records which are identical to one another and play the part that the audience likes the most out of that record. He notices as a DJ basically that, just as today's dance parties, he's looking at the crowd, he's playing his records, and he's thinking, kids are really responding to like this section of the record, and then they kind of lose interest, and that means maybe I need to change the record or like move on to another record. But he's looking for the parts of the song that really get the audience going. And what is that part of the song? Inevitably, always, it's the drum break, right? It is where, as was common in the late 1960s for dance records to have, there's a moment where the band drops out and you've just got the drums, or maybe drums and bass, or maybe drums and congas and percussion. And Kool Herc notices that is the moment when the crowd goes wild in these dance parties. So when he, the whole point of him having this idea to buy 2 copies of the same record, put them on the turntable, play the groove of one, and then fade over to the other to play the exact same groove to keep the party going, it's the drum break that is driving all of that.
Right.
So from the very beginning of hip-hop, the drum kit, or at least the sounds of the drum kit as played on record and then translated through turntable, is what's driving forward that culture and that music, right? And Kool Herc says this himself about, that moment in time in the early 1970s. The same could be said of disco. The same could, in a very similar way actually to hip hop, where they're basically just extending drum break and percussion breaks in dance music, or whether, on the other hand, it's record producers realizing that this is what dancers want as well. And you have folk like Giorgio Moroder saying, you know what, let's just use as many possible channels as we can to record that drum kit. And here we get into kind of record production taking over. We got to remember that like in the beginning of the 1960s, records were being made either on a stereo track, like 2 tracks for a whole band, or 4 tracks by the mid-1960s. By the end of the 1960s, you have 8 channels. What are you going to put on those channels? Interestingly, the answer is not always more instruments. What a lot of engineers decide the thing to do is actually, let's take this drum kit and use 4 channels just for the kit, right? And separate the kick and the snare drum and, a couple of overheads or whatever it happens to be. As record mixing consoles increase in the number of channels that are available, nowadays, obviously, it's limitless. But, at the end of the 1960s, you were lucky to have 8 tracks. Throughout the 1970s, suddenly you get to 16 to 24 to 48. What inevitably ends up occupying most of those tracks is ever greater substantiations of the drum kit. And so, like, that's the sound of record production, right? Over the past 50 years. You could make a convincing case that the greatest distinguishing feature of the development of popular music from the past 50 years and the invention of multi-track recording is that the drum kit moves from being this marginal secondary consideration in record production, even though it was always absolutely core to the live performance of that genre of music. It ends up just taking increasing prominence and increasing space on the tracks of that recording studio, and becomes the most complicated thing to track, also the first thing to track, the foundation of everything else. Any drummer will know this, obviously. Like, they, when you go in to make your album, they're not throwing down, anything other than the drum kit first, because it is considered to be the bedrock on which everything else is built. And because it's all separated through channels, suddenly we can think we're not going to have a successful pop record until we get that snare drum sound absolutely perfect and drive it as forward to the center of the mix. Successful pop record is a vocal and a great snare drum sound, essentially.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Wow.
There's a reason for that. And it hasn't always been like that, but that has driven forward change in genre and change in technology for the last 40 or 50 years, I would argue.
I don't know about you, Chris, but my mind is absolutely blown right now.
It's blown, and it's also full of questions.
Totally.
So like, because I'm now going to the 80s, so like drum machines.
Yeah.
So because they were talked about as the thing that was going to replace drummers.
100%.
And they haven't.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that because they sounded terrible?
No. Well, they did. They did and they didn't. They didn't sound anything like an acoustic drum kit, at least in their early versions. But people got attached to these sounds, obviously, and they became the basis of techno and house music in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. So famously, Roland TR drum machines, TR standing for transistorized sound. Mm-hmm. So they're not using like digital samples. They're using like, a circuit board with wee transistors to kind of approximate that kick drum or approximate that snare drum or hi-hat.
So that was the 808 and 909, right?
The 808, the 909, exactly. At the end of the 1970s, another popular one was the CR78, the computer rhythm 78. Very sophisticated for the time. Yeah. But these poor replacements of the acoustic drum kit became cherished as sounds in their own right, and because they were relatively inexpensive to purchase, these were intended as kind of like practice, things for guitarists to practice with, so they wouldn't need to bring out their drummer necessarily, right? But there is also this discourse of replacing the drummer, of course, and that definitely happens throughout the 1980s, where suddenly people realize like these sounds are awesome. I love a Roland 808 and 909 as much as the next person, and like happy to listen to it. And they became like the novel elements of lots of hit records over the course of the 1980s. Same thing with sampled drums in the 1980s. So you see that happening, the same sort of principle happening with digital samplers. The argument that I want to make in the book, though, is that rather than replacing the drummer, all of those technologies that were maybe initially about replacing drummers actually have the unintended effect of moving the drum kit to ever-increasing centrality in the mix of a record, in the success of a pop hit, so that by the 21st century, basically any musician, whether you're a drummer or not, has to be able to think like a drummer and to, think and also approach record production and songwriting with a drummer's sensibility in order to be considered a competent musician at all, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not so much that drummers are getting replaced. Rather, I think the argument should be that all other musicians have been forced to become drummers.
Well, it's funny you say that, because my college now makes all the instrumentalists learn piano and drums.
Well, exactly.
On the jazz degree, all the horn players and other rhythm section players have to learn to play the drums.
So in the 1990s, when I was studying, every student had to take keyboard skills, piano keyboard skills. Mm-hmm. That was seen as like the archetypal instrument, on which everything else was based. Nowadays, it makes perfect sense that any musician has to have a reasonably competent understanding of how the drum kit works. Otherwise, you'll never, have the basic skill set required to create a successful record.
Not even that, just talk to another drummer. How many times have we found ourselves in a situation with a singer-songwriter who's like, just kind of make it a thing. You're like, what does that even mean? They can't even have a cursory conversation about it.
Yeah, it's a language that people need to learn. Yeah. And whereas before that was maybe a well-kept secret between drummers as a culture, and maybe not a very well-respected skill set, I think now the tides have really turned, really and shifted. It's considered absolutely core.
So where do you see the future then? So because it's been so pivotal up to now. Yeah. What's left?
What's left?
That's
a good question.
Better 808s.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. 808s that can also clean your house. Yeah. It's extremely difficult to predict the future. And so I'm very hesitant to do so. But I think that as a researcher, one of the things I'm interested in, I guess, are the materials out of which drum kits are made, by which I mean, like, it goes back to the old question, what is a drum kit? Is it an acoustic, bass drum, shell, snare drum, and cymbal in some sort of arrangement together, and then all sorts of other additional stuff on top of that? Or are we at a stage now where the drum kit is more an arrangement of sounds that which can be played in any type of technological arrangement, so that your computer programmer at Apple who's trying to get the next iteration of Apple Logic Drummer together, are they having as much of an influence over what constitutes a drum kit for the next generation as acoustic players are? I don't know in a shop like this, like what the differences in sales between acoustic drum kits and electronic drum kits for you guys.
Still massively in favour of acoustic drum kits, but the electronic market has a kind of very different place now. They're really seen as practice instruments, especially for newer players, people starting out that want to practice quietly.
Yeah, but also there's companies are now like Roland, they're now finding, and Yamaha finding ways to
hybridize.
Totally. So it's almost like electronic split into camps, right?
Yeah, a little bit.
So there's electronic kits and then there's hybrid products.
Yeah. So I guess that's a really interesting trajectory to me. That say we want to think about the raw materials that went into making something called the drum kit at different points in history. In the early 20th century, this would be a combination of various renewable materials, woods and metals, essentially. By the late 1950s, for the first time, and we didn't talk about this at all, but you have the introduction of plastic drum heads. Right?
Yeah.
And those become instantly successful. So that by the end of the 1960s, almost no one is using calfskin heads anymore. Everyone is using plastic drum heads. By into the 1980s, suddenly you have electronic drums, which are made of what we might call e-waste, essentially, like circuits and wires, plastic and mesh. Definitely not woods and metals, right? Other types of materials.
They can take different shapes too, right?
Take different shapes, made of fundamentally different things. And then into the 21st century, a third type of material that you could argue drum kits are made out of is data, right? So that actually, we are beyond this point of renewable woods and metals. We're beyond a point of like non-renewable plastic and oil-based products, and into this world of data and code. And that informs our idea, certainly, of what a drum kit sounds like, as much as any of those other versions of the drum kit. So the future is in exploring those territories, I guess.
Yeah. It can go even further. Did you see, was it a couple of years ago, there's a girl called Gemma Hill who used to be the editor of Drummer magazine. She now works for a company in Germany called Geva, who we get certain brands from. She did an advert for Bosch.
Okay.
Where she made rhythm out of everything that Bosch sells. So drills, washing machines, yada yada yada, all these things, all these metallic things. So she would go around and play rhythms on them, and they cut this amazing advert together where it became that became the music. So it's getting a stage where it could go even one step further. If you think about the soundtrack to the Terminator, the original Terminator, all those the kind of backbeats to the theme are almost hydraulic sounding.
Yeah,
it's getting to a stage where kind of anything can be considered a groove, really. You can play. Craig Blundell made a whole series of just recording his house.
Yeah, so I guess another way of putting that is maybe that the drum kit as an idea has achieved a kind of stability which people are now interested in subverting, breaking, bending, and pushing forward. And what seems likely to change is the way in which that gets perpetrated, whether it's on Bosch drills and dishwashers or within my laptop or on a traditional acoustic kit. But what doesn't seem to be going away is the importance of that in the contemporary soundscape. Whereas, in the infancy of the instrument, this was like a marginal sound, a novel sound that suddenly, started to gain traction. Now it's really difficult to think of music, not having drums. At least for the audience of this podcast.
Yeah. But I also don't think the art form will go away.
Yeah, exactly.
So learning to play something with touch and tone and dynamics, because classical repertoire is still playing music that's centuries old. Mm-hmm. So if you go and study a classical percussion degree, you're still playing all these composers' music.
Yeah, the drum kit now has this, well over a century-long history that doesn't mean that like those early drum styles go away. They survive and they coexist with everything that comes afterwards. So it just becomes an increasingly richer culture.
Yeah. It's fascinating because one of the arguments, I don't know if you got this at college when you were there, but one of the arguments was that jazz music went through its whole cycle in 100 years. Mm-hmm. But the drum kit was invented for the music. The drum kit as we know it was put together for the music. And it's still changing. Yeah. I find it really fascinating.
It's a good world to be involved in. I don't know. I'm still interested in the topic even after 10 years of having researched and written about it.
Did you ever find, when you were doing your 10 years of kind of combining this book together, did you ever find any element of stress in that? Because I imagine that's
stress in putting it together.
Yeah, a little bit. Like, and
hell yeah.
Yeah, of course. Because I imagine it can't have been the easiest thing to uncover.
Yeah, man.
A lot of it.
Have you ever seen A Beautiful Mind, where like the guy's got all these notes on the wall and like all this red string? Like, that was me, man. I didn't know what I was doing for a long time. Basically you accumulate all of these notes and these sources and this different research, and you need to kind of put it all together into a story. Broadly speaking, what the history of the instrument is, but you need to kind of weave together all of these elements that I've been talking about, which maybe aren't at the moment a standard part of how we tell that story, and think, okay, well, how do they fit in a compelling way that unfolds with a logic that will make sense for the reader, while at the same time introducing hopefully lots of new ideas and ways of thinking about this.
Yeah.
Like, it took me maybe 5 years before I thought of how to actually structure the book, and then the second half was trying to implement that structure. Yeah. So definitely some moments of stress and wobbliness throughout, but we got there in the end.
Yeah, we did. Hence why you're sitting here right now. Because I know a lot of guys as well, maybe not specifically authors, but guys who are maybe studying, or girls who are maybe studying, they have like a thing where they have a certain thing that gets them in the writing mindset. So like for some people it might be listening to jazz music. For other people it might be they'll have like a bowl of Rice Krispies before they start writing.
Sure.
Did you have anything like that before you started writing?
I found that when I was writing, for me the biggest distraction from writing is the internet. And when I was really getting serious about taking all of the research and notes and getting down to writing the book, the book is 320 pages plus 60 pages of footnotes. And so like it took me a long time to write it, is what I'm trying to say. And the way that I did that I found helpful was to turn off the Wi-Fi router in my living room and take the instrumental jazz records that I'd been collecting like over that time, and just using those as the kind of soundtrack to my writing. The nice thing about that is that you have roughly 20 minutes aside, which is about the amount of time that I need in order to kind of like give my brain a shake and like not get stuck into a funk. So there's something, some people talk about, vinyl sounds better, or it's warmer or whatever. I don't think that's true at all personally. But what it did do for me was like, okay, if you turn off the distraction of the internet and then have this way of like playing music, which entrains you, puts you into a groove, keeps you kind of productive, but then also forces you to get up every 20 minutes and shake yourself off and switch the side of the record or whatever, and then go back to writing. I found that to be, like, practically speaking, a pretty helpful way to get me through the anxieties of actually writing a book. Yeah.
Because I suppose then you also know in your mind that you have this specific 20 minutes to get things done.
Yeah, that's right.
So it keeps you. It's almost like kind of
it's dividing it into small, manageable chunks.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
like practicing.
just like riding a bike.
Turns out you know some of our former guests, Paul Savage and Johnny Scott.
That is true.
It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've been living in Scotland for 17 years now, actually, even though the accent does not rub off on me. It's probably in everyone's best interest. But, in my 20s, I played in bands. And one band was a little indie pop group called Zoe Van Gogh. You'll have to forgive the name.
That's a great name.
But we were signed to Chemical Underground Records, and we put out 2 albums with them, both of which were recorded in Chem 19 with Paul producing.
That's awesome.
Yeah, he's amazing, eh?
Oh, he's a brilliant drummer and engineer and guy.
Yeah,
really nice dude. And then I guess we were touring those records. We toured with lots of different bands, but one of those was a group called Strike the Colors with a young man named Johnny Scott on the drums. So I spent some time in a transit van with Johnny, and also Johnny and the sort of whole coterie, I guess, of musicians in Glasgow's indie music scene. It's the reason why I love the city so much is that it's big enough that there's tons of music happening. You're spoiled for choice. There's always more than one amazing thing to go out to and see every single night. But it's small enough where you bump into the other people who have that same passion for music, and it's easy to make friends, even for like an immigrant like myself, to kind of come in from outside and see familiar faces who are also usually like really nice people like Paul and like Johnny. Yeah. It's just it's a reason to stay.
Yeah, big time. Yeah.
Hell yeah.
How did you find it recording at Chem 19?
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, I'd recommend it to anybody.
Yeah, when we went, because we did a field trip for the podcast, so we thought we'll go and get some footage and stuff, and it just feels like a little, it just feels homely.
Yeah.
I think they're really, really great at making you feel really, really comfortable. Emma was actually in the shop.
Oh, yeah, she was, yeah.
So that was the first I'd ever really met Emma.
Nice.
So she's cool as well. Do you have quickfire for Matt?
I do. So this is a segment that's only ever been in one other episode of the podcast. I'm bringing it back. I'm determined to make it a thing.
Oh god!
Because it can't be. We've been heavy academic, so let's have a little fun, right?
So, strangest thing you've ever eaten?
Oh,
you can blame Google for these questions, by the way.
Yeah. I was in Mexico not too long ago, and they had these dried crickets called chapulines, which were
what?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
They sell them everywhere.
I take my hat off to you if you did. That's amazing.
What did it taste like? Was it
gross?
Yeah.
Because normally I thought it tastes like chicken.
yeah, totally. That's what I was expecting.
Brilliant.
Okay, your current Netflix binge.
Do you know? It's been around for a few years, I think, but my wife and I are watching The Good Place.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
It's a brilliant show.
Yeah.
It's taken our mind off of all of the bad news that's going on in the world
Is that with
these
Ted
days.
Danson?
Yeah, with Ted Danson.
Yeah,
I'd recommend it. It's a really fun, lighthearted show.
It's got Kristen Bell in it.
It does have Kristen Bell. Yeah.
No, it's good.
Sorry. I was
quick fire.
Why is it worst job you had before your current one?
Worst job I had was... I've been really lucky with jobs, but because the worst job was also kind of fun in a way. But I, for one summer, was paying my way through school in a dinner theater, which meant I had to play the drums, which was the good part, but then also in character wait tables and serve drunk people. And they were... Your pay was increased the more you got your audience to drink, and the more they drank, the worse they behaved. And we had to call the cops a few times on them. It was like, wow. This is back in Canada.
Bring that to Scotland.
Yeah,
you'd made a millionaire.
Good Lord, it was where bad actors go to die. Dinner theater. That was probably the worst.
Oh, that's brilliant. Best gig or concert you have ever seen?
Oh my goodness. So many, really hard to choose, but the one that immediately springs to mind is the first gig I ever saw in Scotland. And that was many years ago. When I was a teenager, I was super into DJ Shadow and his album Introducing, which has got some amazing drum sampling and programming on it. And I got to see him at the Barrowlands
Oh, what a venue.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
And, you know, I was 22 years old. I had never heard of the Barrowlands before. All I knew was that I was a kid from rural Canada. This was the closest I'd ever been to, you know, being able to see DJ Shadow. I was definitely going to go. And so not only did I see DJ Shadow at the Barrowlands, but I saw the Glasgow audience for the first time in the world. And like, it was unbelievable.
Yeah.
You know? Like the feeling in the room was amazing.
I saw him support Radiohead.
Oh, amazing.
And it was my very first ever concert. I was 17.
That's a good gig to go to.
Teenage Fan Club, DJ Shadow and Radiohead.
Nice.
Yeah.
Wow.
Nice.
So, but DJ Shadow at the Barras would have been... I mean, the Barras for anything's amazing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Big
yeah.
time, yeah. I saw Father Son at Barrowlands.
Oh, wow.
And that was mega.
Yeah, I bet it was.
They were absolutely brilliant.
Yeah.
But I think the atmosphere of the room, there's something about that room.
Yeah.
Man, there's something about it. It's just...
The floor bounces. Like the floor moves when people bounce on it. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's just phenomenal. And especially if people are there to see someone, if it's a headline show as well, and it's a hometown headline show especially, it's just, wow.
Yeah.
Biffy in there as well, Biffy Clyro. Yeah. Favourite biscuit?
A biscuit I'd never even heard of until moving to this country was the Jaffa cake.
Yes. And confirmed that it is a biscuit. There you go. You heard it from a doctor. There you go.
I feel like it's a cake.
Is it a cake
feel
or a biscuit?
It's a great debate.
It's on the cusp.
Yeah, that's maybe the most diplomatic answer to that.
Yeah.
It is both. Is that the mold for quickfire?
Pretty much, yeah. I had one written down called Unpopular Opinion. So this is
Well, I feel like a vinyl not being the best sound is already the most unpopular
There you
opinion.
go. There's your controversial opinion for the day.
What's next for you, man?
Well, great question. I'd like to make some more music. And actually, in terms of research, having written this book on the drum kit, my next idea for a research project is to kind of extend that and assemble a team of people to do a research project on the history of mass-produced instruments more generally.
Oh, wow.
Because I think that one thing that really got me excited about writing this book on the kit was that it started out being a history of the drum kit, but what it ended up being, for me anyway, was being a history of music from a perspective of a particular instrument. And I just thought that was such a refreshing way for me to engage in thinking about popular music history in new ways. And I would love to do something similar for instruments, for basically thinking about a history of music from the perspective of instruments as a whole. And conveniently for me, mostly in academic scholarship, most of the existing research on musical instruments kind of ends when things start being mass-produced. That's where a lot of scholars lose interest. But for me, that's like where my interest begins.
Oh, wow.
So thinking about the history of instruments as a way of talking about, for instance, globalization and its history, thinking about like the rise of, for instance, East Asian musical instrument manufacturing being a really interesting mirror to talk about the changing political dynamics between continents and the move away from like a European imperial model towards an American industrial model towards a more globalized model where you have different elements at play, not least East Asia. You can tell that actually, like just thinking about like what companies and what manufacturers are popular at different moments in history and how do those things influence one another. So I think there's like a whole lot of interesting questions one could ask around that area. I haven't done the research yet, so I don't actually know what the answers are, let alone half the questions, but that would be a direction I'm interested in exploring.
Cool.
Do you still play? Do you still play regularly?
Yeah. I play less than I would like to, just because the day job as an academic, sort of teaching, marking, writing, researching, this sort of thing takes up a lot of time. Not so that I don't enjoy it, I do, but I love playing the drums. So
what kit do you have?
At the moment, because I live in a 2-bedroom tenement flat, I've got just a wee Yamaha hip gig, which that came in those crazy yellow colors. So I had to afford myself the dignity of getting that rewrapped in white marine pearl. So I've got this little Yamaha hip gig, but got a white marine pearl finish on it. One day if I had more space, I'd love to, get a larger drum kit, just by which I mean like a proper 22-inch kick drum. And, I was looking downstairs at your showroom, and that Sonor vintage kit with the white marine pearl finish.
Good choice.
Looks pretty sweet to me.
Yeah. That's the kit you've basically got.
That's when we were talking about that. Yeah. It's no secret how much I love that drum set.
Yeah.
Having sold them for 15 years, that's been my favourite kit that I think I've ever owned.
Yeah.
Where can people buy your book?
You can order it online via all the usual places, so Amazon, etc. Although, if you want to get the best price on it, I actually have a discount code I can share with your listeners.
Holla!
Booyah!
So, it's published by Oxford University Press, and if you go to their website, which is oup.com/academic, and you enter the discount code, and this is in all caps, AAFLYG6. I wish they could have made it easier to remember.
Well, we will put it in the show notes and stuff, and we'll be sure to, when we share the episode, we'll be sure to let people know.
Amazing. So if you punch that code in, then you can save 30% off the retail price. But you could also go to your high street and ask Waterstones to order it. They won't. It's not the kind of book that they'll have in stock, but they'll definitely have it on their computer available to order. It's got international distribution, so
amazing.
It should be easy to find. And Amazon and all the rest of those places where folk can buy books as well would have it as well.
Do you use social media?
I do. Yeah, I've got Twitter where I'm Dr. Matt Brennan, and then on Facebook, I've got pages that are one for Matt Brennan and another one for Kick It, a social history of the drum kit. And I should also say that hopefully we'll have to see at the end of this month, on Thursday, March 26th, I have a book launch scheduled at the Old Hairdressers, which is free to enter, where we'll have copies of the book, and where Glasgow jazz drumming legend Stu Brown will be playing a live set, taking us through the evolution of drumming styles.
Yeah, 'cause he's done that Twisted Tunes thing and all that.
Yeah, exactly.
Raymond Scott thing's amazing, eh?
Yeah, he's a brilliant player, and he's got a keen interest in history, so that will be great. However, it is at the end of March, and so we'll have to kind of watch this space for coronavirus, unfortunately. So if we have to cancel it, we'll just postpone it until a later date. You can search on Eventbrite the words "Kick It Book," like 3 different words. It should bring up the event, and if we do cancel it or postpone it, which at this point seems possible, then we'll let folk know, how to find out more information about the new date for it when the time comes.
Sure, great.
Nice
well,
one.
Thank you so much for coming to see us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah,
thanks for having me.
We could probably do like a part 2 and 3 and 4.
Yeah,
with
definitely.
the
we
amount of
could quite
information that's
feasibly sit here for another
in your
hour.
brain, but
Yeah.
man, that's been really insightful and something really different. So we really appreciate you.
It's made for a great teaser for the book, I believe.
Jeez, I hope folk listening, if you're interested in getting yourself a copy, I hope that you enjoy it, and let me know what you think.
Great, definitely.
Thanks, Matt.
Cheers.
Take care.
Thanks.